Well, to be honest, I had a slightly differing opinion, but Dr. Janil's
Go for it.
was like, okay. No,
Very convinced.
I was like, whoa, okay.
In a world increasingly defined by disruption, from climate shocks and pandemics to social fragmentation and economic uncertainty, Resilience explores the systems, communities, and individuals finding ways to adapt and thrive. This podcast dives into the intersection of climate, health, and the human spirit to uncover what it truly means to be resilient in the 21st century. Hello everyone, welcome to the Eco Business Podcast. My name is Jessica Cheam and I'm delighted to be hosting this latest conversation in our podcast series on resilience. In this episode, I am delighted to welcome as our guests Dr. Janil Puthucheary, Senior Minister of State, Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment and Ministry of Education, and Man Jing Kong, co-founder of Just Keep Thinking, otherwise known as BioGirl MJ. Dr. Janil, MJ, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I think resilience as a word has been increasingly important in our times. And in this past year in particular, we've seen an unprecedented velocity of change globally with geopolitical tensions, conflict, trade uncertainty, as well as an accelerating climate crisis, along with social instability in many communities. And so I think there's like a certain, mental toll living in an age of planetary and political crisis. And so, Dr. Janil, if I can invite you to share your thoughts, how can Singaporeans and those in our region actually start to respond in such an age?
Well, indeed, the geopolitics is changing. We can see climate change happening in front of us. But the situation has always been changing. And Singapore as a nation, Singaporeans as a society, we've had this narrative of being open to the world and exposed to the risks of the world, a small, vulnerable city-state with no natural resources. This is like the National Day kind of narrative, right? For all time since we were independent. So the sense that we're exposed to these risks because of what other people are doing or what other countries are going through, and that we have a part to play, is not so new for us. But now we have to turn our attention to what that means for climate change and what that means for us and what we can do about it. We've designated 2026 as the year of climate adaptation. And that in itself is an important signal for our sense of agency, that we can say, look, mitigation efforts have to continue. We have to keep doing everything we can to mitigate. But also now is a time to focus our attention on what we can do to adapt. And in truth, the poly crisis isn't all doom and gloom. It's not like there's no rays of hope. I think, for example, when the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement, there was an assumption that all the international climate mitigation adaptation efforts would collapse. And that was not so. Actually, countries continued to submit their NDCs. People remained committed to sustainability as a cause. Institutions and organizations actually doubled down, right? And found other ways to get things going. And here in Singapore, that's also no different. One small example, our commitments to solar deployment ahead of time. And then now we raise our ambition even further. So I think we have to take the view, look, the road towards sustainability is not going to be smooth. It's not going to be a single trajectory. There's going to be ups and downs. And we have to find our way to do what we can when we can do it and get it done effectively.
Thank you. I love your sense of optimism because I think sometimes when you read the headlines today, it can be quite easy to fall into sort of like a doom and gloom, especially if you've worked in the impact space for a long time. But maybe MJ, I'll bring you in here. I mean, you are one of the leading youths in our society and you interact with, I guess a whole, spectrum of people as well through your work. Do you find, that I guess Singaporeans and people in the region responding to this in a healthy way? Have you seen, what have you seen actually, on your travels?
Well, I've seen a range of emotions, right? Different people, they have different lived experiences. So there's anger, there's sadness, there's frustration, but I also do see hope in people, right? And I think that's very, very much key. And I think the key question here, right, we're talking about resilience, like what can I do in this situation? So, of course, my role here, I feel, and a role as the youth is not to remove these uncomfortable emotions. I think emotions are important because it gets us a bit concerned, but that's why we care. It gets us to take action, but with these emotions, what can I do next? So I think that's the important question. And that's something I tell to many of the youths out there, right? Like, I acknowledge your emotion, we acknowledge each other's feelings, but what can we do next, right? How can we turn this emotion into action, into curiosity, into community, and bring people together? So I think that's the key part when it comes to all of these feelings that we are experiencing right now.
No, I really like that. And I think, I was speaking at the Climate Youth Development Program last week that's organized by NYC and MSE. And it was a group of, 40 youths like really energized about the future. But then I could also tell through their questions, that they had real anxieties, like what jobs would be there for them. And also somebody asked about ecological grief, and climate anxiety. How do youths actually process the fact that the world is changing at such an alarming rate? And it seems like, we're reaching these planetary boundaries. I mean, any thoughts there, in terms of like processing that?
Well, I think the point that the emotions and getting people involved, I think is very real. And young people indeed are getting involved. It's not that there's this sense of whether they're having ecological grief or anxiety. I think if you're not a youth, you might say, oh, and then that's it. That's the end of it. But that's not what we're seeing, right? I mean, they're actually stepping forward and getting involved and contributing to how we can solve some of these issues. And we've had lots of examples, ground up groups. Earthopia, you were involved in Earthopia as well, and
last year.
and you see, you have the ones that you know about, and every time you go for these things, you see new groups of young people stepping forward.
Yeah, I think that's super encouraging. And the crucial thing here is really for youth not to fall into apathy, right? To sort of like then have this like deep sense of anxiety and not do anything about it. And I think the year of adaptation has been a really interesting one for Singapore. And I've covered the COP negotiations for like 2 decades now, right? And I've seen that conversation move from really about mitigation to now today, climate being a lived reality and countries acknowledging that they need to really be looking at adaptation. But adaptation is extremely local, right? And it has to be funded by local governments as well. And I think there's also a conversation here about how does adaptation get funded. And Dr. Janil, I wonder, how is Singapore thinking about, the funding aspect of it? That's one. And then also the trade-offs, right? Singapore, as you mentioned, has been a small country for many decades, sort of like living this existential experience. And I think there's always been trade-offs in our development journey. And now on top of mitigation, we have adaptation. So how do we actually, as a policymaker, think about all the trade-offs that we need to make as a small nation?
Well, the trade-offs, the word trade-offs is bandied about, but the issue is that there isn't a trade-off between mitigation and adaptation. You need both. The ongoing efforts around mitigation, if we are successful and as we are more successful around mitigation, it will mean that you need to buffer in less effort and concern around adaptation. The better our adaptation is, the more impact whatever mitigation efforts we can take will have. So there's a reinforcement between the two. It's not that you do either mitigation or adaptation. You have to do both. There is a trade-off when it comes to the actual resources. Financing is one example. And so you do have to think carefully about where your investments are and what are the returns on that. One of the things, whether it's climate or any of the other existential crises that we have faced in the past, that there is really a no regrets move in terms of investments and expenditure is in developing people. And so whatever the challenge, having the opportunity to develop and us supporting that opportunity to develop is going to be useful to us as a society and as a nation. And just getting back to the point then about young people, right? We have things like the SG Eco Fund. We have resources which help young people then develop their skills, go out and get exposure to real world challenges, work with groups, go to COP, represent Singapore at COP. This is a real world exposure, capability development, and then helping young people to translate that into action. So that type of investment where, well, it's going to be useful to us as a society, it develops our people, is always going to be important. The bigger picture then on climate financing, I think is worth talking a little bit about. It is one of those areas where people continue to do so. This issue of, is it all doom and gloom? Has everybody withdrawn? And the answer is no. Actually, internationally, a lot of instruments and a lot of organizations are continuing to put money into the transition financing. And here in Southeast Asia, Singapore, we had the FAST-P financing arrangement. We had some of the financing money at COP. Commitments continue to come in. So I think these types of efforts suggest that, yes, people recognize the difficulty, but whether it's developing young people, thinking about the balance between adaptation and mitigation, financing the climate.